Dead men don't tell tales, but sometimes they get X-rays and ECGs. It's not that I'm afraid to die. I just don't want to be there when it happens. Woody Allen. Most patients who die in the hospital are either sick from a chronic disease or acutely and severely ill. When a patient dies, it is usually expected, or at least not a surprise. But occasionally a death happens unexpectedly, and it is a shock to the whole staff. The classical scenario is that it tends to happen late at night. The patient dies in his room after the night shift nurse looks in on him for the last time. When the morning shift comes on at 7 a.m., the nurses start reviewing the reports on all the patients before seeing them. Meanwhile, the patient in 2355 is dead and no one realizes it. Any tests scheduled the night before have not been canceled and are about to be carried out. It just so happened that in this case, the patient in 2355 who had died the night before was scheduled for a morning chest X-ray. Some X-rays are ordered as in-room X-rays that can be done at bedside by a technician using a portable machine. But on this occasion, the patient was scheduled for a 2-view X-ray, which meant bringing him down on a gurney to the radiology department and having him sit upright to obtain 2 views, front and back. Sure enough, at 7:30 a.m., before any day shift nurse had seen the patient, a transporter came in to wheel the patient to the radiology department. Apparently, the transporter, who was occasionally known to take the morning to sober up after a late evening, didn't notice that the patient did not move or offer any resistance when he was placed on the wheeled stretcher, or that underneath the blankets he was cold to the touch. So the bleary-eyed transporter put the patient on the gurney and took him down to X-ray. The radiologist, who was probably at the top of his class in medical school, happened to notice the patient wasn't moving. He examined the patient and observed he was stiff and cold. Radiologists are not used to making diagnoses. Often that's why they went into radiology. But this one, unafraid of stepping outside his specialty, made a quick and accurate diagnosis. The patient was dead. For the radiologist, this was no small accomplishment. He hadn't seen a dead patient since his residency. He then went further and took the initiative to make an executive decision by canceling the X-ray. Unfortunately, he wasn't sure exactly who to inform of his diagnosis, so he called the senior physician he knew in the hospital, me. I came down to radiology and immediately confirmed the diagnosis. He's dead, all right. I congratulated him on his diagnostic acumen and saw him swell with pride. As I made arrangements to get the body to the morgue, the radiologist approached me. Considering what had just happened, he was remarkably nonchalant. I think he was feeling a little full of himself, being the one who figured out the patient was dead, so he let his sense of humor kick in. He didn't get many opportunities like this, and he wasn't about to let it pass. Dr. Franklin, the next time you want to get an X-ray on a stiff, do me a favor. Order a portable X-ray. I don't do 2 views on dead guys. Radiologist humor. Of course, our joke about radiologists was that their official flower was the hedge. Another time, a terminally ill patient was admitted to the open ward. He had an intravenous line that was placed in the emergency room and oxygen by mask, but he was dying. Death was imminent and expected. He had a do not resuscitate order in his chart, so that when his heart stopped, no attempt would be made to revive him. Shortly after being admitted, he died. The nurse called me over to pronounce him dead, which I did, and she was about to take his intravenous line out and remove his oxygen when she was called away urgently to another patient. So there was this dead man lying in bed on the open ward with an oxygen mask and an intravenous line running when the electrocardiogram ECG technician came over to do an ECG. He hooked up the ECG leads, and since the patient was still warm, the tech didn't think much of the fact that he wasn't moving. I was with some students who were about to tell the technician that the patient had expired, but I sensed my opportunity and held the students back. Just let the tech do the ECG. They looked at me strangely. Why would I do that? Of course, the ECG was a flatline. Dead people don't have any cardiac electrical activity, but the tech apparently didn't notice that, or more likely, he didn't care. He left the ECG readout on the desk next to the patient and went off to do his next one. I seized the moment. At the other end of the ward, oblivious to all this, was one of our most pompous preening residents. I told the students before approaching the resident, "Let's see what happens." I walked over to the resident and, in my most earnest voice, said, "Mark, that patient in the first bed, the one with the oxygen, looks a little pale. I think he may be having a myocardial infarction, a heart attack. Could you check out his ECG on the desk? If he's having an MI, we're going to have to bring him down to the ICU." The resident didn't like me, but was impressed I would accord him such responsibility. I had given him authority. He walked over rather quickly and did exactly what I hoped he would do. Part 1. Instead of examining the dead patient, he went straight for the ECG. He looked at the flatline ECG. Part 2. Again, he responded predictably. He didn't believe the ECG. Since dead people rarely get ECGs, the most common cause of a flatline is a loose recording lead on an arm or leg, or alternatively, a faulty machine, which is what the resident assumed. Part 3. He called the ECG tech back and berated him. "What's wrong with you? This ECG is flat. Is your machine working?" The ECG tech was cowed, and I felt a little sorry for him. He was genuinely puzzled and assured the resident he had done 2 more ECGs since then and had no problem with his machine. This just infuriated the resident. Part 4. "Well, then do another ECG on that patient." By now, my students were enjoying the show. Unwittingly, the pompous resident had just ordered an ECG on a dead person. While the ECG tech was hooking the patient up, the tech, not overly bright, had still not figured out the patient was dead. My students started snickering. Until then, the resident had reacted predictably. At this point, I had no idea what would happen next. The resident stood over the tech while he did the ECG, and again he saw a flatline. This time he believed there was indeed no heartbeat, but he didn't realize that the patient had been dead for 10 minutes, and he didn't know there was a do not resuscitate order. He simply assumed the patient had just had a cardiac arrest. Part 5. He called a code, an emergency resuscitation procedure. "Someone call the arrest team. This person is having a cardiac arrest." At this point, my students were laughing. The resident was calling for resuscitation on a dead patient. Then I had to step in. "Mark, maybe you should listen to his lungs, see if he's breathing." Part 6. He looked at me quizzically, took his stethoscope, and put it to the patient's chest. Naturally, he heard nothing, and then he realized the patient was dead and had been dead for several minutes. It took him about 5 seconds to put together what had happened. He just sneered and uttered an obscenity under his breath directed at me. I didn't hear the imprecation because my students, who never got much of a chance to make fun of a resident, were by now laughing out loud. I actually got the idea for that little trick I had played on the pompous resident from something that had happened to me years before. When I was a young resident, one of our responsibilities was to work up preoperative patients who were scheduled for elective surgery. At that time, the surgeons required that all patients coming into the hospital for surgery, even for simple procedures, had to have a history and physical examination before their operations. This workup was a screening for any medical problems that might arise during surgery. A generation before, the surgeons did their own preoperative examinations for routine operations. Eventually, most surgeons abandoned routine preoperative workups and, unfortunately, many of them abandoned routine postoperative care as well. Surgeons today, except for the good ones, are often only interested in what happens in the operating room. Before and after the operation, the patient is someone else's responsibility. So it fell to us lowly internists to do the medical evaluations before the patients went to surgery, just as it often fell to us to take care of them after surgery. One night early in the evening shift, in my role as medical screener, I was examining an elderly man who was being admitted for a minor procedure, removal of a hemorrhoid. The patient was healthy and the whole thing was quite routine. Suddenly, my pager went off for a cardiac arrest somewhere else in the hospital. Back when the day shift ended, the resident who was in charge of the resuscitation team had handed off the code beeper to me, and it was my responsibility to answer any cardiac arrest calls that evening. I quickly excused myself from my patient, told him I would return soon, and went to the resuscitation at the other end of the hospital. When I arrived at the room of the patient who had arrested, the resuscitation was already underway. I was the senior medical officer, so it was my job to coordinate the effort. The patient, whom I knew nothing about, was hooked up to a portable ECG machine that had just been wheeled into the room. In those days, every room did not have cardiac monitors, and I was forced to make decisions as to what drugs to use and when to use the defibrillator based on the information from the continuous ECG readings from the portable machine. Things did not go well. For nearly half an hour, despite frantic chest compression, a battery of drugs, and intubation, we had no success at restoring the patient's heart activity. All the ECG ever showed was a flat line. In medical parlance, this was called asystole, no heartbeat. We worked for another 10 minutes on the patient, when we had gone nearly 40 minutes with the flatline ECG and no evidence of a heartbeat. It was my decision as the senior physician to call the code, that is, end the resuscitation effort and declare the patient dead. At that point, because I always wanted to be sure, I took one last look at the ECG. It was still flatline, so I asked someone to feel for a pulse. There was none, so I called the code and ended the resuscitation. Calling the code was a routine I knew well. The clock says 5:57 p.m., so that's the official time of death. I want to thank everyone. You did a great job. I'm just sorry we could not save the patient. The nurses set about removing the patient's intravenous lines and preparing the body. The patient's resident thanked me, saying he would write a long note in the chart explaining the circumstances and would notify the family. There was nothing more for me to do but sign the resuscitation sheet, attesting to the time and details of the death. Once that was done, I wanted to get some dinner, but first I had to head back down and finish the preoperative evaluation of my surgical patient. Nothing difficult, and wouldn't take more than a couple of minutes. If I was lucky, I could finish before the cafeteria closed. I completed the history and physical exam and drew his blood. In these days, we had to draw blood from patients ourselves on off hours. The last thing to do before sending him to the surgical ward was to get an ECG. Unfortunately, it was after hours and there was no ECG tech around. The surgeons would not accept him without a preoperative ECG, which I would have to obtain and interpret. Without a tech, I was forced to do the ECG myself. Today, a physician doing an ECG, let alone a blood draw, is unheard of. Another example of how medicine has increased its specialty roles. Unfortunately, there was no ECG machine in the pre-op area. There were also no nurses to tell me where I could find an ECG machine. I knew of only one ECG machine available, the one we had used minutes before in the cardiac arrest. So I trudged back over to the ward on the other side of the hospital, and sitting there was the ECG machine we had used. I told the nurses I had to take it over to the pre-op area. I would just be borrowing it and would return it after dinner. I wheeled the machine all the way back down to the pre-op area and told my patient we would be finished as soon as we obtained an ECG. I instructed him to lie on the examining table and removed his shirt and trousers so I could affix the leads to him and record the ECG. Coincidentally, my father was one of the people who invented the old suctions that attached to a patient's chest to obtain the readings for the ECG. That old machine still used them, so for me, taking the ECG was a reminder of my heritage. Once I had the machine attached, I began recording the ECG. The readout of the patient in front of me, smiling and talking, showed no cardiac activity. Nothing. Flatline. Asystole. That clearly could not be the case, since the patient was obviously alive and comfortably resting on the examining table. After making sure the leads were placed appropriately, I repeated the ECG. Absolutely no cardiac activity. Nothing. Asystole. Flatline. The explanation was obviously that the ECG machine was faulty. Finally, a nurse came by and told me where I could get another machine, and I repeated the ECG. With the new machine, his ECG was normal, and I sent the pre-op patient up to the surgical ward for his operation. At that point, something occurred to me. The faulty ECG machine was the same one I had used minutes before to make decisions on resuscitation in a patient in cardiac arrest. It showed a flat line then, and the flat line it showed now was obviously a mistake. Was it in error an hour earlier when I had declared the patient dead? Could the first patient have been alive? Although there were other indications that the patient was truly dead, that broken ECG machine has always bothered me. Maybe the flat line on the first patient was false. I will never know for sure. I passed on dinner that night. I suddenly had no appetite. Sometimes dead men tell no tales because death comes quickly and unexpectedly right in front of your eyes. One evening, an unfortunate construction worker was brought in with an unusual but not unheard of problem. He had been working at a construction site not far from the hospital when a piece of steel pipe fell several stories and pierced his skull. He was alive, but in a deep coma when he was admitted. He was taken directly to the operating room with a foot of pipe protruding from the top of his head and another foot protruding behind his jaw. Neither the junior neurosurgeon nor his staff had ever seen anything like this before. The patient was obviously dying in front of them, and they had no idea what to do about the pipe. This happened nearly 40 years ago, so of course there was no internet to search. The neurosurgeon was forced to make a quick decision. He decided to remove the pipe from the patient's skull. Today, neurosurgeons with experience believe the best thing to do is to cut off as much of the ends of the pipe sticking out of the body as possible, cauterize the area, then gradually inch the pipe out to minimize the pressure shifts in the brain. Simply to pull the pipe out of the skull in one thrust, no matter how logical it seems, is definitely the wrong thing to do. Unfortunately, the team didn't know this. Everyone was quietly stunned by the scene confronting them. The neurosurgeon looked around the room and said, "Anyone know what we should do here?" Silence. The neurosurgeon then said, "Well, if no one has a better idea, I think we'll go ahead and just pull it out." The patient was quickly anesthetized, and then the surgeon and one of the other residents just took the end of the pipe protruding from the top of the skull and pulled it out. In less than 30 seconds, before the surgeons even had time to put the pipe on a surgical specimen table, the patient was dead. The patient's brain herniated through the bottom of the skull. The neurosurgeon looked up at the whole team, speechless for a moment. He then took off his mask and gloves and said, as matter-of-factly as possible, "Well, that wasn't the right thing to do." No one said a word, and everyone slowly filed out of the operating room.